Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be, as a friend, as an old enemy. Take your time, hurry up, the choice is yours, don't be late. Take a rest, as a friend, as an old memory. Come doused in mud.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Chase Thomas and I am the Executive Director of the ABU Education Fund and our sister organization, the Alliance for a Better Utah. We're grateful that you could all be here today. The ABU Education Fund is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization dedicated to civic engagement and good governance. We see hosting debates and panels during the elections season as an opportunity to work toward increasing civic engagement, and we're pleased to be doing so here tonight. This is the third in a series of 3 panels called Unpacking the Initiatives, looking at the 3 propositions that will be on the ballot next month. And this one is on redistricting reform, so we're excited to learn more about that. We're glad to be partnering tonight with 2 organizations, the John R. Park Debate Society from the University of Utah, and also the Utah chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network. We thank them both for their partnership and for being here tonight as well. We're also grateful for the director of the John R. Park Debate Society, Dr. Michael Middleton, for being our moderator tonight. And at this time, I'm going to turn the time to him. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mike Middleton, and I'm the director of the John R. Park Debate Society at the University of Utah. I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion and look forward to facilitating a conversation between the 4 panelists with us tonight who bring a variety of expertise to the issues raised by the upcoming vote on Proposition 4, the Independent Redistricting Commission Initiative. Before I introduce them and explain the format of tonight's discussion, please join me in thanking Chase Thomas and the ABU Education Fund, as well as Dr. James Curry of the University of Utah and the Scholar Strategy Network for organizing tonight's discussion. While tonight's panelists will likely contribute a great deal more to our shared understanding of Proposition 4, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a ballot measure that would create a commission to draft maps for congressional and state legislative districts for approval by the state legislature. The members of the commission would be appointed by the governor and the leadership of both the majority party and the largest minority party in the legislature. Additionally, qualifications for the commission outlined in the proposition aim to limit partisan bias held by those appointees and requires that maps drafted by the commission are responsive to a number of criteria aimed at creating fairly drawn districts. Tonight's discussion will begin with each panelist offering some opening remarks about issues related to the proposition grounded in their expertise. From there, I will pose some questions to the panelists, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. And of course, the panelists will be free to pose questions to one another. And then we'll conclude by offering each of the panelists the opportunity to offer summary remarks about the discussion we've had tonight or the ballot proposition more generally. Before I introduce the panelists, please join me in turning off your cell phones, pagers, and other devices that might interfere with tonight's conversation. And additionally, I would like to ask that during the discussion, you refrain from interrupting the conversation, except for now, when I hope you'll offer a warm welcome to each of the panelists as I introduce them. First, we have Michael Lee. Mr. Lee serves as Senior Counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mr. Lee practiced law at Baker Botts, LLP in Dallas for 10 years, and is the author of a blog on redistricting and election law issues that the New York Times has called indispensable. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lee. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Maccabee. Dr. Maccabee is an assistant professor of political science at Binghamton University. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the Political Institutions and Public Choice program at Duke University, where he was also a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. His research interests focus on American political institutions, particularly Congress, parties, and polarization. Dr. Maccabee. Joining them, we have Dr. Michael Creston. Dr. Creston is director and curator of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center and professor of political science at the University of Oklahoma. His research focuses on legislative politics, congressional elections, and political geography. His work on redistricting shows that when independent commissions draw legislative districts, they are more compact, divide fewer communities of interest, and that they are more competitive when the power to draw those districts is removed from state legislatures. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Creston. And last but not least, we're joined by Jeffrey Wright. Mr. Wright is a co-chair for Better Boundaries, the primary campaign behind Proposition 4. Mr. Wright is a private equity investor with global experience in a variety of industries, including biotechnology, real estate, debt, reinsurance, and venture startups. In addition to a variety of other past positions, he's a current member of the Board of Visitors for the University of Utah, the Pacific Council on International Policy based in Los Angeles, and a member of the Atlantic Council based out of Washington, D.C. Please welcome Mr. Wright. So with that, I will ask each of the panelists to offer some of their opening remarks on tonight's topic, and we'll begin that with Mr. Wright.
Thank you. Delighted to be here and honored to be with such an august group of individuals to talk about what we believe is one of the most important issues that we're going to have on the ballot this November here in Utah. The why of Better Boundaries, Proposition 4, is that we fundamentally believe that voters should pick their politicians. Politicians shouldn't pick their voters. That's a very easy slogan to say. It's a very easy slogan to talk about. Gerrymandering is actually a very complicated issue, as I'm sure we're going to get into tonight. But at the fundamental level, we believe that the will of the people in a representative democracy is subverted when politicians draw the lines to their own benefit, whether that's incumbency, whether that's for partisan reasons, whether that's they want to get rid of an ex-wife that lives in the district that we saw in the South. These are various reasons why people gerrymandering, and we are opposed to this, and we have a proposition on the ballot, as mentioned, that would create an independent commission made up of both Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated voters that would draw the lines using standards. And these standards include keeping communities together, not using partisan data, not using incumbent addresses, and we'll get more into detail about this. But we believe that this independent commission is going to draw better boundaries, that is going to benefit the citizens of Utah and allow them to have true representative democracy. From a philosophical level, I think democracy is on the rise globally, but the quality is diminishing. And many academics, economists, political pundits, they often talk about why that is the case. And we're not the worst scenario in the world. I mean, we have Venezuela, we have Russia. We're certainly not there, but I think voter turnout shows that Americans, Utahns, are very dissatisfied with the system. And therefore, gerrymandering is often cited as one of the reasons that is the case. And so we're trying to address that through an independent commission and standards. We're excited to talk about this issue today, and we think that an independent commission and a better way of drawing our boundaries is going to increase voter turnout, it's going to increase voter satisfaction, it's going to create more transparency, it's going to truly express the will of the people, and we think it's going to be a better outcome for Utah.
Thank you. Dr. Creston.
you. I first want to thank ABU, SSN, and UBU for having me out here. Like a good social scientist, I came in on Saturday and toured the state, although most of you are national parks. Try to learn a little bit more about Utah. Some of my colleagues here have spent more time here and are clearly experts, I think. So just a little bit about my research. Some of my earlier research has looked at the competitiveness of congressional elections and who draws the boundaries. So the big picture, what I find is when you have commissions or actually even courts draw congressional district boundaries, you get races that are more competitive. So if you can take redistricting out of the hands of the legislature, you tend to get more competitive elections. And so I looked at that over sort of a 40-year period. Some of my other research that was alluded to earlier, we started to look at outcomes and thinking again about who draws the districts. And when you have independent commissions draw districts, so these are states like California, Washington, and some others, the districts tend to be more compact. And we threw 3 or 4 different measures of compactness at this. And this is both at the legislative and the congressional level. And so districts were almost always more compact. Nevertheless, occasionally they sort of look the same as when you have the legislatures draw the district. And then we looked at some other questions about splitting communities of interest. And there's a couple, there's different ways to look at this. You can think about counties, which is one way. Although in some states like California, you have Los Angeles County, which is bigger than in some states. So we looked at counties, but also cities and towns as well. And again, when you have the independent commissions draw the districts, you end up splitting fewer, what we call communities of interest. So we tend to get, as a social scientist, I try to shy away from saying things like better districts. I'll let others, if they want to say better or worse, and I'll close my few remarks here with, I try to, when I talk to people, I'll say, well, what do you want to do? And I'll suggest a plan, or I'll sort of, suggest when people have done these in the past, these are the outcomes that they get. So I don't come into this with an agenda, with a pick of sort of what I want as the outcome. So I'll stop there, and we'll explain more to talk about later.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maccabee.
Thank you. I'm also grateful to Better Boundaries and ABU and the Scholars Strategy Network for bringing us together tonight to talk about this important issue. I'm like Dr. Creston. I approach this as a social scientist and as a student of political science. I spent time in classes thinking about questions of democratic theory. And there's a few things that we think that democratic systems ought to do. So number one, we think that systems that we use to elect officials ought to be responsive to majority rule. That is, it shouldn't be the case that I can control, if I belong to one party and I get less than half of the votes, I shouldn't get more than half of the seats in the legislature. And the second thing I think that we focus on in terms of democratic theory and social science is that there should be a sense that the representatives elected from districts are representative of the populations that those districts represent. And then the third thing is a little bit tricky. The devil really is in the details here about other values that we might want to encompass. That in the United States, we think that we elect legislators from districts, and we think that legislators ought to represent some geographic physical space. So my research has been focused on trying to understand how states like Utah draw their districts in ways that either meet those criteria or fall short of those criteria. And I can tell you that in Utah, in terms of the first criteria of a majority controlling a majority of the seats, that's definitely happened in Utah. So this is a Republican state where Republicans routinely win a majority of the seats. That's no surprise. Where Utah tends to fall short is on the second criterion, where the minority party is underrepresented in the congressional delegation and perhaps in the state legislative districts as well. Now, the initiative, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, at greater length throughout the evening about the other aspects of the other values that these districts should encompass. And one of the things that is appealing about Proposition 4 is that it strives to encompass additional values that we think districts ought to have so that we maintain communities of interest, that the districts remain relatively compact, that political jurisdictions are maintained whole. These things are also important, but I think in the hierarchy of things that political scientists or social scientists or democratic theorists care about, these always come third after we think about these more general questions about majority rule and representation more generally. I've done I've done research on Utah. Some of my research deals with using computer algorithms to try and understand how districts would look if they were drawn completely neutrally. And in Utah, at least for the congressional delegation, it's grossly out of whack with what we would expect had districts been drawn in a neutral and fair way. I'm happy to talk about that more as the evening progresses, but I think I'll turn the time over to Michael.
So thank you, everyone, for having me here and allowing me to be part of this panel. I thought tonight I would talk a little bit about, in my opening remarks, about the national landscape and a little bit about what is going on nationally, because gerrymandering certainly is something that has long been a problem in this country. It's something that we've long done. The term itself goes back to 1812, but the practice actually goes back before that. Even the framers of the Constitution, as great and noble men as they were, engaged in their fair share of shenanigans. Patrick Henry very famously tried to draw Virginia's very first congressional map in a way such that James Madison, who he despised, could not win a seat. He was unsuccessful, but the practice has been with us a long time. However, what has changed, and what you have really saw in particular this decade, is the rise of what we call extreme gerrymandering. In other words, gerrymandering is getting worse, and there are a couple reasons for that. I'll go into it. But this decade's maps overall have been some of the most durable gerrymanders ever, and a couple of reasons for that. One is that we know a lot more about voters than we ever have, and that makes it possible to draw maps with greater precision based on all kinds of data that map drawers now have access to. Computers also make it possible now to draw not 3 or 4 maps and pick where you pick the best out of the 3 or 4 maps, but you can draw tens of thousands of maps and artfully slice and dice and recombine voters and in ways that you can pick the one that locks in the most disproportionate advantage for your party. And that's really what we mean by extreme gerrymandering, where you sort of have this skew that is both unrepresentative and then it's impossible to get rid of it. So take Pennsylvania, for example, a 50-50 state that has had a 13-5 congressional delegation for all of the decade up until this year. North Carolina, similarly, is 10-3 in favor of Republicans. But you see Democrats do this in other places, like Maryland and Illinois. So this is not a one-party sin. But we've always tried to do this, right? But the problem in the past is that you didn't have the data, you didn't have the technology to get it right, and so after a cycle or two, the maps would break down, and your party, even if you tried to lock in a disproportionate share of seats for your party, you would lose. That doesn't happen anymore. So, and it's only going to get worse. One of the briefs in the Wisconsin partisan gerrymandering case talked about how things that map drawers dreamed about in 2011 as fantasy will be very commonplace when the maps are redrawn in 2021. And that's affecting the politics of a lot of states. So in the lead up to 2010, or in the lead up to the 2010 elections, map drawing takes place a year after the census, so in 2011. In the lead up to the 2010 elections, knowing that who won in 2010 would effectively draw the maps, a lot of money was poured in, frankly, by Republicans because Democrats are a little bit asleep at the wheel, into states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and places like Round Rock, Texas, in order to flip state legislative seats in order to be able to control congressional redistricting. And so what you had in these states is really a very nasty nationalization of politics in ways that you hadn't before. You had lawmakers who had run for office for 20 years and they thought, I know how to campaign. You know, we talk about bridges, we talk about schools, we talk about these issues, and suddenly all of these nasty ads were flooding the airwaves talking about how they were in league with Nancy Pelosi, or they, comparing them to Barack Obama or what have you. And lots of people will tell you that has forever changed the tone of politics in some of these states because they haven't been able to put it back. And that is, and again, Democrats were asleep at the wheel in 2010. There are lots of signs that Democrats are not asleep at the wheel this cycle. In fact, Eric Holder and President Obama have created a group of organizations that are designed to do exactly that, win seats for Democrats in state legislatures so they can gerrymander congressional maps. And that is something that should be alarming to all of us, right? And it's only going to get worse. Already the parties are talking about pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into legislative and local government elections in order to be able to they would tell you, the Democrats would tell you they just want to see at the table. I'm not as positive about that. And so I think there's a lot to be concerned about, because whatever people tell you about, we've always done gerrymandering, this is not a big deal, it is becoming a big deal.
Excellent, thank you all. I want to continue in a similar vein to the comments you were offering, Mr. Lee. And before we discuss the proposition itself, take an opportunity to describe the problem that Proposition 4 aims to address, both in general terms and as it is or isn't manifested in Utah. So Proposition 4 aims to limit or prevent gerrymandering in Utah's state legislative and congressional districts. So I'd like for each of you to take a few moments to educate voters on exactly what gerrymandering is, the techniques that legislatures utilize to produce electoral districts that are skewed toward one party or the other, and if you're able to, the extent to which that's relevant to or demonstrated by electoral districts in Utah. And we'll start that discussion with Dr. Maccabee.
Sure. So the operative definition for gerrymandering, I think, comes from Black's Law Dictionary, because it was quoted by Justice Scalia in the majority opinion in Veith versus Jubilerer, which is a recent decision, relatively recent decision in 2004, in which a plurality of justices said that this question of partisan gerrymandering is not actually justiciable. That is, the Supreme Court doesn't have a manageable standard that they could use in order to evaluate whether or not systems of districts were actually gerrymandered. A plurality of justices disagreed and said, actually, there's a whole host of these metrics that social scientists have used. It said, if you look at districts in various ways, perhaps as Professor Crespen has offered, suggested you might look and see how compact they are. My colleagues and I, in work that I've done, have proposed metrics that say, we can measure gerrymanders this way, and we'll say, and if they meet certain standards, then we can conclude that it is in fact gerrymandered. There's a host of these that social scientists have provided that seem to be well understood, and the liberal justices on the court said those are good enough. In the middle of the conservative wing that said this is not justiciable, and the liberal wing was Anthony Kennedy, who's no longer on the Supreme Court, but he said, I side with the conservatives in the sense that none of the metrics we've seen do a good job. However, I'm not persuaded that there isn't a metric that political scientists or sociologists or computer scientists or mathematicians could come up with. And so for the following 5 or 6 years, there's been a scramble among social scientists to try and figure out how it is we can identify what's going on in systems of districts, and how we can do it in a way that would persuade Justice Kennedy that there is a problem and that this problem is fixable. Now, if you've been paying attention to the news, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Justice Kennedy is gone. He's retired. He's been replaced by someone who almost certainly, even though he was one of his law clerks, doesn't think that this question is one that the Supreme Court can address. Which is why something like Prop 4 is so important, because we can't look to the Supreme Court to solve this problem. The solution is going to have to arise from voters and politicians, frankly, in states, doing an honorable thing and saying we're going to set aside perhaps our partisan interests in order to draw maps that satisfy some of the democratic standards that I talked about and we've talked about before, so that people will buy into the democratic process in places like Utah. The issue in Utah at the congressional district level, and what we know from in terms of electoral geography in Utah is that there is a concentration of Democrats that live in and around Salt Lake City. There are actually Democrats that live throughout the rest of the state of Utah. You might know some of them. I don't know. The districts in Utah were drawn in such a way that they evenly divided Democratic voters across multiple districts. And the problem with that is that it dilutes the influence of those voters to a degree that they no longer have a voice in at least the congressional delegation in Utah, and their influence has been diluted as well in the state legislative elections. And there's various ways that we can show this using relatively straightforward statistical techniques. And the advantage of approaching this question using an initiative is that it will do exactly as the Better Boundaries group has suggested. It will take this question out of the hands of politicians who are going to seek to advance their own interests and hopefully pursue more honorable and more virtuous goals by drawing districts in ways that will avoid some of the entanglements and issues that have led to this dilution of a large group of voters' voices in the democratic process in Utah.
Dr. Creston, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I might back up a little bit. And so the first question was, how do we define gerrymandering? So there's a way to define gerrymandering that the courts have asked for, and I think my colleague's given a good rundown on that. I'll give the simple one that I tell my students. So gerrymandering is just the conscious drawing of district boundaries to benefit one group or another. Most of what we see in gerrymandering now, we think about as political gerrymandering. State like Pennsylvania, as we've already mentioned, 50-50 split politically, 13-5, I think I remember those numbers correctly, in terms of representation. So I see that as gerrymandering. Now, the Supreme Court wants a different standard than that, but that's sort of a simple way to think about it. And a little bit about the techniques. There's two sort of main techniques that we think about for gerrymandering. There's what we call packing. So that's taking an area and packing as many sort of like-minded or like-voting people into that area, and so you're wasting votes. So you might get a district that is, 80% Democratic, and so those every vote that's past your 51% is essentially wasted in that area, and it makes the areas around it much more usually sort of the other partisan way. So that's one technique, and then there's cracking. So the way I see Utah at the congressional level is cracking to take the core Democratic area and you crack that up into other districts. And so you split up this area of partisan strength, and sort of the Democrats, if there's enough who live in one area, aren't able to elect essentially a person of their choosing. And so those are the simple techniques. That's what I see in Utah, sort of from a mile-high view. So I'll leave it there. Mr. Lee?
Sure. So when it comes time to draw maps, there are lots of different choices that you could make, and lots of people come to the process with different ideas about what the ideal map would be as a whole, what their ideal district would be if we were to pass out maps of Utah here and ask people to draw districts. There would be a lot of, there'd be some overlap, but there would also be a lot of disagreement. The problem with gerrymandering, and again, I'm going to talk about extreme gerrymandering, which really occurs when one party has control of all of the levers of power and uses that map to prioritize political effects above all else, above communities, above geography, beyond anything else that you might want to bring to the table. The number one goal when one party has control of the process is maximizing their political power, protecting incumbents. And that's, again, you know, that only occurs when one party has all of the levers. And the effect of that is that, you know, many of the things that people do value, you know, when I go around the country and talk to people about maps, they say, well, my community was split apart, or a town is split into 5 different parts. It doesn't make any sense. You know, we're not getting any representation because we're represented by 5 different people, and nobody cares about us because we're not the core of any district. You know, those are the sorts of things that people care about, and those get shunted off to the side. And the way that you do an extreme gerrymander, I think this is an important point to understand, is that you don't draw districts that your party wins. If you're the gerrymandering party, you don't draw districts that your party wins by 80%, right? Because if you're doing that, you're being very inefficient. What you want to do, if you're gerrymandering, is you want to spread your voters out as much as possible in order to win as many seats as possible. And you want to split apart or pack, if you can, people of the other party. And so in Utah, you know, there seems to be a lot of cracking. In other places, there is packing. But you know, the goal in all of this is to maximize political. You know, they come in with a predefined goal, and that is to maximize political power, and that supersedes everything else that we tend to think of as important. You never even get to have the robust debate, the conversation about whether, you know, the district should be drawn to the east or the district should be drawn to the west. The only thing that matters is politics. And again, if there aren't limits, you know, the Supreme Court is getting worse. You know, the data and technology are becoming that much more powerful. Dark money is able to flood into states. This is going to be a problem in more and more states. Last cycle, it was Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. In the future, it's going to be virtually everywhere.
So, Mr. Wright, I want to sort of start focusing on a discussion of Proposition 4 specifically. And as you already identified, it would replace the legislative process with a commission whose members have to meet certain qualifications and whose maps have to achieve or strive to achieve certain criteria. So why don't you take a moment to explain what those are and how they would substantially differ from kind of what we have in the status quo. And after that, I'd like to ask the rest of you to comment on how this proposition has been constructed, and in particular on the criteria for future maps that Mr. Creston described.
So a couple things here. One is, as mentioned, both parties are sinners in this process, Democrats and Republicans. And Better Boundaries from the very beginning is a multi-partisan effort. There's Democrats, Republicans. I'm a Republican, and I'm following the tradition that Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, the late Senator McCain, all thought that gerrymandering was a national disgrace. And so we wanted from the very beginning to set up a process. We're not focused on an outcome, but we wanted to set up a process that created transparency, that created an independent commission, took the power away, not power away from the legislature because they still have ultimate authority on it, and we're going to talk about that, but it really put it in the hands of a citizen commission that we felt was a check and balance with power. But I really want to say that our initiative is to eliminate all partisan gerrymandering. It's not a Republican or a Democrat or an unaffiliated and independent effort. This is a multi-partisan effort, and we really feel strongly that this isn't about the sins of the past. This is about the process, a better process for the future. Our initiative sets up a commission. We studied many states and what's been done in many states, and we set up a commission. It's going to be made up of 7 citizens. They cannot be political. They cannot come from parties. They cannot have run for office. They cannot be lobbyists. So we really wanted to get citizens on this commission. The chair is appointed by the governor. There are 2 unaffiliated commissioners that are appointed by the legislative leadership and the minority leadership. There are 2 Democrats that are appointed by the legislative leadership, legislative minority leadership, and 2 Republicans that are appointed by the Republican leadership. So we tried to create a balanced commission, and again, we saw this as a real check and balance. They will draw the map, and they will use standards, and those standards include keeping communities of interest together, keeping boundaries and natural landscape together, not allowing incumbent addresses to be used, and various other things that we can talk about further. But we really felt like this was setting standards and putting a commission together. They would recommend this map to the legislature, and the legislature would have an up and down vote. And we did that because the Constitution in Utah states that the legislature has the final authority on maps. And so we created a process that we believe will be constitutional.
You mentioned that you looked at several other states when you were developing sort of the plan for the commission in Utah. Do you want to talk about sort of which states, commissions you kind of aligned most closely with, and what the results were that led you to kind of say this is the best plan for us to adopt in Utah?
This is a Utah solution to a Utah problem. So we looked at Arizona, we looked at California, we looked across the country, but we really formed this to fit within the state of Utah and fit within the constraints of the Constitution, which gives the legislature the final authority. So this really is a Utah solution to a Utah problem.
Thanks. Dr. Creston, would you like to comment further on the proposal here in Utah?
Sure. Maybe I'll think about the last question that you posed, and I don't want to say it's not a Utah solution, but it's just sort of I look at other states, and so I see a state, Iowa. I think their plan is probably in some ways similar to this. So the legislature in Iowa gets an approval. There's questions about keeping counties intact there. There's trying to keep the closeness with other political boundaries, and then also not considering where incumbents live. And so, in sort of in studying Iowa, what I see frequently is you'll see two incumbents will get drawn in together. So in there, they're sort of only looking at population numbers, and so that's the one thing we do remember we have to keep is the districts have to have the same number of people in them. You can't sort of move past that. And in Iowa, there's frequently cases again where incumbents are drawn together, and that's where you're going to get lots of competition because you have two strong candidates. If they're different parties, maybe the general election or maybe in a primary election. So sort of just looking at states that are similar and what are the outcomes that we get. That's one that I see that maybe has a parallel here. And again, it's not to take away from the Utah plan. There's only so many things you could do here, and most of the commissions, sort of have lots of similarities. And in some ways, that's a good thing because there's these same kind of standards that we want to hold different states to.
Dr. Maccabee?
So the commission as it's being set up here is, I appreciate that it was Utah solving a problem for Utah, but I would echo Professor Crespin's comments that what we see in this commission is similar to what we see in other places. There's slight differences. One thing that I would point out is that one of the things that's explicitly laid out in the proposition are these criteria that districts have to meet. So take, for example, maintaining communities of interest. Communities of interest is something that lots of states have on the books as something that needs to be maintained. So for example, in Wisconsin, which was the subject of litigation that went before the Supreme Court this last year, there was a requirement that they maintain communities of interest as well. And those that were defending the plan frequently pointed out, said, well, this map does favor Republicans, but that's because we've striven to sort of maintain communities of interest, and if we hadn't done that, then we would have violated this state statute. And so frequently, communities of interest can be something that map makers will hide behind in order to justify gerrymandered districts. The second thing I want to point out is that Professor Crespin's research has shown that in certain ways these commissions have operated in a way that have made elections more competitive. There are reasons why we might want elections to be more competitive. They've done other things that we might think are good. So for example, they might maintain relatively compact districts. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either. So as we're folding in these values that and the proposition is explicit about this, we need to be clear that the goal here, the underlying goal here is to have a system of districts that people can buy into and they feel like they're having an effect on the outcome of the election when they're participating in that process. And I think the value in something like Proposition 4 is that it provides a transparent process for people to understand how this is actually happening, that it's not happening in a law firm, in a locked room at the back of the law firm somewhere where they're running computer simulations to maximize some outcome, that we have citizens that are engaged in this process, and that will yield a better outcome. And I would only point this out to say that there are, by some metrics, there are some of these commissions that have not performed better than their state legislator counterparts. So by some of the metrics that people have proposed, Arizona's citizen-drawn map actually performed worse than the legislature-drawn map. Iowa is an exception to this. Iowa's map is exceptionally fair. It represents the citizens of Iowa very well. So the way that this is actually implemented is going to be important. This is an important first step to lay this groundwork and say what it is that we want to do, but the actual implementation is going to be important. And because it's statutory, the state legislature can push back. They can make changes after voters have decided, and they might push to change things and push the commission in a direction that moves it further away from the kinds of values that the Better Boundaries group has tried to implement through the proposition. So this is an ongoing problem that really, this is not the end-all be-all, but it is definitely a step in the right direction in terms of yielding better and more democratic outcomes.
Mr. Lee?
Sure. So, this may be a Utahn solution for Utah, but it really, in a lot of ways, is a model for other states, right? Because it strikes, I think, a really smart balance on a lot of things. It doesn't completely cut the legislature out. It gives the legislature the ability to come in and say, Commission, you got it wrong in a meeting, in a really big way, and we're going to draw a map that we think does better. If the legislature does that, though, it has to explain why its map is better. And likewise, citizens of Utah, if they think the legislature or the commission got it wrong, they could sue and ask a court to decide, based on these new, stronger rules, whether the map actually complies with the requirements of law. In addition, I would say the commission does a lot of really good things, some of which are borrowed from other states, but Utah would be among the first states to actually include unaffiliated people in the process. Right now, it is a very political process in most states, and in many states that have commissions, they're Democrats and they're Republicans. There is no room for the growing body of people who say, I don't quite fit in with either of the parties. In Utah would follow on California in doing that. The Utah proposal also would strongly enhance public participation. Members of the public would be able to submit maps and have them considered by the commission. That can be really, really powerful. Typically this is a process that has occurred behind closed doors or political operatives. In Ohio, it was political operatives in a hotel suite overlooking the Ohio State Capitol that they called the bunker. I'm not sure how a windowed hotel suite could be called a bunker, but they did. This would be a much more transparent process, and that can make all the difference in the world. And I'll give you an example. In Virginia, lawmakers, when they gerrymandered the state legislative map, they came up with all kinds of explanations about why, we had to, this map may be biased in favor of our party, but it's because we had to keep all these requirements of law, and there's no way that we could avoid it. And the court was able to say, because there had been a student competition to draw maps, no. There's a student map here that does all of the things that you say that you have to do, and it doesn't actually seem biased in favor of your party. So what you're putting on the table is pretextual. And in the same way, public participation in Utah in 2021 can help police the process because it will be a much more open and transparent process. So this is, in a lot of ways, a really smart proposal. It strikes a balance between having a commission do it and having the legislature do it. And that I think many states will look to if Utah adopts this.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Creston, your research indicates that among states that have utilized independent redistricting commissions, those states have generally seen gains in terms of what you identify as traditional redistricting principles, more compact districts, fewer split political subdivisions. Could you talk some about those findings, maybe in terms of a pre-redistricting, this is what some states look like, after redistricting, this is sort of the consequence of implementing a commission, to give us sort of a tangible sense of what we might expect in Utah should this pass and implement?
Sure. It's a little hard to put an exact number on things. I do want to back up for 1 second. I think it appears that Dr. Maccabee and I disagree, and I don't think we do actually. So my research, I tend to look at everything together. So I'll let's take all of the commissions and lump them into one place, and let's sort of see on average what do we get. I think some of my colleagues' research says maybe let's look at Arizona and see what we get out of Arizona. And it's two very different ways, and both acceptable ways, I think, to do social science research. So with my colleagues' research, you could see like, maybe Arizona, these parts we don't want in our commission. Whereas I tend to think, well, let's look across the whole country and see what we get and we do it this way versus that way versus breaking it down to much smaller steps. So I think both have something to say. So in terms of splitting the counties and the communities of interest, so one thing that we did is we looked at these independent commissions and we looked at what did the districts look like before they implemented the commissions, and the outcomes look exactly like when you have other legislatures draw. So this is an important way to look because you could say like, oh, California, they have their commission, but California just does things the California way, and the commission had no effect. So the way is to look and see what happened before, then the plan's implemented, what happens afterwards. So in these states, when we lump them together, before the commissions, they look just like the other legislatures. So there's nothing special about these particular states that they're getting the outcomes. To me, there's pretty clear that it's the commissions that are changing what's going on. And you asked a little bit about again the numbers. It's hard to give a number because counties and other communities of interest, they can be so different. So for example, if this plan is implemented, your biggest county is going to be split no matter what, right? So in my model, I would say, oh, the county was split. But if there's districts could be roughly 800,000 people, maybe give or take. If your county has more than that many people, you're going to have to split it. So I think you have to be careful about how you do measure the outcomes there. I think my measure is probably, those things sort of count against me, but I still find my effects. So yeah, it's really hard. LA County, I don't know how many times LA County is split, but I think you have to see what are you starting with, and what are you going to end up with.
Dr. Maccabee, was that?
Yeah. So Mike has suggested that we disagree, but don't agree, or I'm not sure. I think we do. I think
we're looking at different things.
That may be true, but I'm not sure that we're both looking at the right things. And so, but one point about an issue of compactness. So, North Carolina was forced by judges to redraw their map, and they redrew in part because they drew incredibly strange shaped districts in order to generate what are called majority-minority districts. There's a large African American population in North Carolina, but it doesn't live in one location. It's spread out throughout the state. So in order to draw districts that contain a majority of residents who are African American, they drew these long, sort of snake-like districts and districts that had odd shapes. And the court pushed back and said, no, these are weird-looking districts. You need to have them be compact. So they redrew the map with compact districts, with the use of computers, and the outcome of the redrawn map, in terms of all of the political outcomes we might care about, besides compactness, stayed exactly the same. Compactness is a useful metric. However, some of Professor Crespin's work has been on how do we measure compactness, and what's the difference between measures of compactness. And some of the bottom line there is there's not a lot of differences, right? So we can measure compactness in a variety of ways, but because we have access to computers and really good data, we can draw compact districts that do things we don't want them to do. The second thing, this is going back to a point that I tried to make about communities of interest or political jurisdictions. So you can imagine a nightmare scenario in Utah. It's one very similar to the one in terms of Utah's congressional districts in terms of outcomes now, which is we could maintain every single county in Utah as whole. Every political jurisdiction in Utah could be held constant. But we divide up Salt Lake County 4 ways. So we've only divided one county in the entire state. And we've met a whole series of criteria that we're checking off the list. But we'd end up with almost exactly the same outcome as we have right now. And one of the challenges with these criteria is that you can pick and choose from them and say, we've satisfied some of these. So in Virginia, Mr. Lee was correct in saying that the student map helped the judges say, look, you can do a lot better. But the metric they were looking for wasn't maintaining communities of interest. It wasn't maintaining counties as whole. It was saying, what is this yielding in terms of outcomes? And how is this affecting representation? And is it distorting the democratic process in a way that would entrench a majority or one party in a majority that doesn't deserve to be there? In Utah, the issue is that we can maintain all sorts of, we can write down a list of things that we want the commission to do, and they might be able to do that, and we would still see a system of districts that would yield an outcome where there's a large group of Utah voters who live in and around a particular area that just so happened to be the place where it was convenient to divide them up. I do think that we need to think about how it is that we measure, and this is important for commissioners to understand, because we need to understand what the impact of these districts is beyond sort of checking off the list of things that we can do. I have literally programmed a computer to satisfy a series of requirements that can yield outcomes that look very different from what we would hope to achieve if what we wanted was a system of districts that was representative of the population it was seeking to represent. I guess so that's the difference in terms of the metrics. And I think I'm a great admirer of your work, Mike. I don't disagree with it, but you're right. I think we are measuring different things, but measuring the different things has a big impact on whether or not we think, we sign off on saying this is a good set of districts or this is not a good set of districts for achieving the purpose of elections and democratic processes.
Sure, and then Mr. Wright.
So, in terms of whether it's a good district or a bad district, or whether a district you want to emphasize compactness or not, we could disagree, right? I mean, in any given instance, some people would value, if you had two districts, one of which was more compact than the other, but the other did better at keeping a community together or followed school district lines or followed natural geographic boundaries, the people in this room would disagree about which of those two they would want. But the point is that under the Utah proposal, one party doesn't get to make that decision, right? They don't, in other words, to approve the map, you have to have a supermajority that, including one of the unaffiliated members. And so that really, there should be back and forth negotiation about this, because reasonable minds will differ. But one party shouldn't get to make all the decisions, and one party shouldn't get to use compactness or some other criteria as a pretext for doing something that's political, right? And in terms of, could you draw a map that is skewed against one party or the other in Utah and still do all of these things? Yes, in theory. Could you get it passed by the supermajority? That's less likely, right? I mean, it's conceivable, but it's less likely just because, if you can imagine in a state where Republicans come and say, gosh, we're going to create this map that gives us all of the districts. You could see, no Democrats going to vote for it, the unaffiliated might not vote for it, and then it doesn't pass, right? And so, it's important to look at this amendment, this proposition holistically and understand that all of these checks and balances, the rules, the map approval process, the public participation, the right to sue. All of these things work in tandem to increase the likelihood that a map is a product of reasoned negotiation and isn't just a partisan gerrymander.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, you can respond to any of that you want, but in particular, to just sort of refocus the discussion on Utah, if we were to apply the criteria of Proposition 4 to the current electoral map in Utah, state legislative or congressional, I imagine you've done some thinking about how many of those districts would sort of pass muster in terms of those criteria, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that as you're responding to the other issues.
I'm going to answer that tactically because Better Boundaries is a coalition. It's a coalition of Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated voters. We have to go out and get on the ballot, which is a very difficult thing to do in Utah. We had to go around and get we gathered 190,000 signatures across the state in 26 of the 29 Senate districts. It was a difficult process. And how we did that is through a coalition, volunteers, and we were very dogmatic in this process of saying this is not about an outcome, this is about a process. We were trying to put forward a commission, standards, and a process for the future. And so we really have not delved into what has been done in the past, how the sins of the past affect the current political system. We are clearly focused on a process. So we believe that we have a good process, and it's nice to hear the intellectual heft at this table sort of support that. This is the best panel I think I've ever been on because usually I'm being grilled by unfriendly reporters or people asking a lot of questions. So it's really nice to be on a panel with the intellectual heft here, who's somewhat supporting what we're talking about. But really, we are about a process. That's an easy question for me to answer.
Well, I don't think I'm asking particularly about how many seats will flip post this being passed, or that to happen. Because I get that's not the goal. But how many of these boundaries do you think are insufficient in terms of the criteria a independent commission would be asked to apply? Electoral districts that would have to be redrawn under the requirements.
Again, I'm going to answer that we really haven't thought too much about that. We're trying to win an election here. This is about a campaign. This is about a ballot initiative. It was very difficult to get on the ballot. Now we've got to win. We're not taking anything for granted. And I really have to answer that we put forward a proposal. We put forward an initiative. We believe we have a good process. We think this is going to create accountability and transparency and better outcomes. But we're not going to focus on what is wrong now, and we're going to focus on the process.
So I will say, if I could just really quick.
Yeah, and then I have a question. Okay.
As to like what boundaries have to change, the people of Utah will help decide that. And I'll give you an example from California, where a district was drawn that the people who created the California Commission never envisioned that this sort of district would be drawn. But it's a district in the foothills of Los Angeles that keeps various communities in the foothills together. Now, those aren't necessarily, that's not a logical district because, you can't actually drive through the foothills without leaving them. You have to go down into the valley, so people go down to the valley to shop, go to school, and do all of that. But the people in the foothills came to the commission hearings repeatedly and said, we have one really big problem that we share that is not getting attention in Sacramento, and that's wildfires. We're divided into so many districts, nobody actually pays attention, and we really worry about wildfires. We want that to be a priority. We want somebody who is our guy or our gal in Sacramento who's going to fight for wildfire funding and so on. And the commission decided to create that district. Now, would they have been justified in creating other sorts of districts? Sure. But they heard that testimony and they decided on all things balanced, we should create that. So the public participation that will come in with this amendment will help the commissioners decide what to do. And there may be, some of these will be some people will come in and make comments based on politics or whatever, but other people will come in and make comments about communities. And after you hear all of this over and over, the commission will have some tough choices to make, but they'll have a lot of information to do that. And so, it is very much a communal process.
Great, thanks. So, Dr. Creston and Dr. Maccabee, I want to ask you all to address a different issue for just a moment, right outside of potential changes to boundaries or election outcomes. In states that have implemented independent redistricting, are there other measures that would suggest that this is just generally good for the health of democracy in those states, that voters have more confidence in the election process, that voter participation changes down the line once this happens, that people feel like there's some meaningfulness to the process that didn't exist prior to those commissions being put into place? Either of you that would like to respond to that?
So some of the research that I've looked into, so this isn't mine, but others, when you have more compact districts, voters tend to know who their member is, and that's generally a good thing. I can't think off the top of my head of any surveys about satisfaction, those sorts of things. But I think just knowing who's representing you is a good thing. I think some ways too, on the flip side, if the members have a bigger incentive to get to know the voters as well, you might end up with representation that more closely matches what people want in the district.
This is actually an open question, I think, in political science about how the district boundaries influence the questions that you suggest. So realize that legislative districts create a kind of ecosystem in which politics occurs in a state. And when you change, just as you change a natural ecosystem in some small way, it can lead to a cascade effect that we don't anticipate. I think there's a lot of ways that changing districts and changing boundaries of these districts will yield outcomes that we don't fully anticipate. So I think actually some of the clearest work on this is actually done by Professor Creston. We've talked about that already, where we see more competitive elections. But it'll be interesting to see, and I understand that Better Boundaries is not interested in talking about outcomes. That might be a politically savvy move. But one of the things that would happen if it was possible for a Democratic Party to compete more broadly in Utah is you might see a more vigorous Democratic Party emerge, which would allow for better candidates to be fielded in some of these districts and would allow for more competitive elections down the road. So in the short run, I think we see more competitive elections. We have very little understanding in political science, at least, about how changing this ecosystem of districts will change politics in some of these states. One of the reasons, self-interestedly, I want to see more of these kinds of initiatives go onto ballots and be passed by states is because it provides data for someone like me to try and understand this question. So I can think sort of in the abstract that I think something like this is a good idea, but there are some questions we don't know. We don't know the answer to. But being focused on the process rather than the outcome is helpful in that regard. But I think in many ways we don't know. And I'll leave it at that.
I have one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. But sir, I'd like to ask you to sit down. So
I'm going to stay standing. This is totally one-sided, and I just want to remain standing.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
The last question I want to pose before we turn to audience questions relates to the aspect of the proposition that leaves final approval of proposed maps in the hand of the legislature, and in the event they reject the map proposed by the commission, the legislature is empowered to create an alternative map that would have to abide by the criteria identified in the proposition. Some contend that this means there will be little change. Others contend that it will enable better oversight and the opportunity for legal recourse from folks of varying interest on the proposition. So I want to ask those of you who'd like to respond, in particular Mr. Lee, what you think about those comments that have been in the media about this proposition.
Yeah, the reality is that right now in most states, you could drive a truck through the rules that exist, and they're really not very meaningful. And in most states, there is not an express ban on partisan gerrymandering, which this would create for the first time. So regardless of what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court, there would be a Utah right of action if political data was considered, if the addresses and comments were considered, or if a map unduly favors one party or the other, and there's a measurement issue there. But it would give you the ability to come in and ask the Utah Supreme Court, the Utah courts, to weigh in on this issue and to judge. And so that's really big. Again, because we don't know where the U.S. Supreme Court's going, and nor do you want courts in Washington to be the end-all be-all, right? And so, that is a really big thing. It's something that we're starting to see more and more in other states. There are 3 other ballot initiatives on the ballot this fall in Michigan, Missouri, and I'm forgetting one other. Colorado, yes. And they all have sort of similar language. Ohio's legislature unanimously passed very similar language, and it was overwhelmingly approved by voters, 70+% of voters in May of this year. And so, this is a smart move.
Excellent. Anyone else want to comment on that? Mr. Wright?
Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. There are questions, there are details that have to be worked out, but I think this is going to be a very transparent process in and of itself. If the legislature if they reject the maps, they have to explain that to the citizens of Utah. And I think that's going to be a very interesting process if that takes place. So we believe this is a transparent process. It brings it out into the light of day. Sunlight's a wonderful disinfectant, and we think this really changes the dynamic.
If I could say one other thing, people should not also forget that in many states, the real battle is sometimes intra-party, right? We talk about Democrats and Republicans, but there oftentimes are games that are played within a party. When leadership controls the process, it's the speaker, it's the people who are in control in the state capitol who control the process and hold that over members and use it to reward and punish members. And so, sometimes you can end up with districts that are fairer within, say, the Republican primary or the Democratic primary.
Excellent. Well, we'll take a few audience questions. So there is someone in the audience who will be bringing the microphone to you. Please keep your questions brief so that we can get through as many as possible. Clearly, this gentleman has a question.
Sure. Thank you. I might mention this is the first time I've ever been to an event sponsored by a debate society that made no effort to present anything other than one side. My name is Ernest Istook. I teach political science here at UVU. When Oklahoma redrew its congressional boundaries in 2000 and went to court, I personally created the map that was court approved against all the other maps that were presented to it. I dealt directly with all the issues that we were talking about here. And I've never heard, in the hour, I've never heard anyone mention what is in the subsection that talks about partisan symmetry. All the discussion saying you have to disregard political data is undone by subparagraph 5, where it says that partisan political data and so forth can be used to achieve the objective of so-called partisan symmetry, which is trying to say that whatever is the percentage of the political party in the state, they ought to get the same percentage of the votes.
That's not what that means.
Just a minute. The term is not defined. May I finish? You've had an hour.
I'm happy to.
Let me finish.
Sure.
Let me finish. Partisan symmetry is used in this as a mandatory requirement. It's not prioritized among the others. It's mentioned as a mandatory requirement. And if your goal is to achieve partisan symmetry in Utah, the number of registered Democrats in Utah is 198,000 out of 1.6 million registered voters. There's a lot of unaffiliated voters too. Point is, why is this poison pill that undoes the advantages of a commission by basically requiring gerrymandering to achieve so-called partisan symmetry? Nobody has mentioned the inclusion of that poison pill in this initiative.
Thank you, sir. Will you give the microphone back to the person who will be taking questions?
So I'm happy to address this question about partisan symmetry. So it's easy to misunderstand what partisan symmetry.
It's not defined.
Well, it's defined thoroughly throughout political science and political science literature. And so partisan symmetry does not mean proportional representation, which is what you suggested. Those are two different things. Partisan symmetry means that the impact of a Democratic vote will count equally to the impact of a Republican vote in terms of the translation of votes into seats. So we know political science has been well established since 1898. You can
Been
read
rejected so
read
far by the
Edgeworth
Supreme Court.
1898 to show where this notion of symmetry was first proposed, and it has been repeated over and over again since then. That it is the case that once a party achieves a majority of the seats, they receive a seat bonus. But it should be the case. It should be the case in Utah that Democratic votes count equally as Republican votes. Just because votes are being cast for one party doesn't mean that they should be completely disregarded by the system of districts that are elected. That's what symmetry suggests. It doesn't suggest proportional representation.
And I will add, the amendment talks about unduly favoring a party either in intent or effect, and I think hopefully...
Except for the purpose of partisan symmetry, it says.
Well, you can't unduly favor. And so the reality is, like, in places, it is hard to achieve, there are reasons why you would not necessarily have partisan symmetry, right? I mean, there are places where it's hard to draw Republican districts. There are places where it's hard to draw Democratic districts. I live in Brooklyn, New York, in a state assembly district where Barack Obama got 98% of the vote and Hillary Clinton got 96%, and Donald Trump was a third-place finisher, right? And so, like, you're not going to be able to draw Republican districts in central Brooklyn. It's just, like, physically impossible. And likewise, there are places in Utah where it would be very difficult to draw Democratic districts. And that's okay, because that's how people are. But what you can't do is you can't artificially slice and dice people to create like a 10-3 balance in North Carolina, which is a 50-50 state that voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but at the same time it elected Dwight Cooper, Democrat, for governor, right? And Pennsylvania is another 50-50 state. Michigan is another 50-50 state that has, and these have wildly skewed congressional delegations. And what the rule in the amendment or the proposition requires is that you take that into account. Like, and so let's say like you end up with let's say you end up with a 4 Republican congressional delegation, and you can show through evidence that was really unavoidable, or like it's a reasonable choice, or that results from neutral considerations. That's okay, but and so it's simply a test. And so I oftentimes say it's akin to like getting up and going to the bathroom a lot at night. It may mean that I have diabetes, or it just may mean that I have a small bladder. But it means that you get to go out and you get to, that gives you a check, and it says, whoa, this seems out of whack. Maybe we should take a closer look at it and see whether it's a result of neutral factors or whether it's the result of somebody putting their hand on the scale.
Anyone else like to comment? And is there another question? We'll go ahead and get the microphone moved over in your direction.
Oh, there's one there. No poison pill intended. This is about Utahns. This is about Utahns deciding the maps. This is about Utahns deciding their fate. There's no poison pill.
Partisan symmetry is.
Thank you, sir. Would you like to ask a question?
So you mentioned previously that if this commission is put in place, that it will reinvigorate the Democratic Party in Utah, as well and get better Democratic candidates, in turn bringing it, like reinvigorating the Republican Party. But you also mentioned that there are these commissions in California, and I would just like to ask, have we seen this change in California, where both parties are reinvigorated and we are seeing those better candidates? And if so, in what way?
Well, there certainly are, in California before the commission had an infamous bipartisan gerrymander. Republicans said, we're going to keep our seats. Democrats said, great, we're going to keep our seats. And they threw the maps in contorted ways to make sure that happened. There's a district that ran 200 miles up the coast, and in many cases it disappeared when the tide came in. And so, the new districts are much more compact and much more logical. What it resulted in is, a higher degree of, California is a fairly democratic state. What it resulted in, though, are changes in what kind of Democrats, in many cases, won, right? There are more. California is also a very diverse state, right? And it's a state where white Democrats maintain power by very carefully using minority voters and keeping their numbers just low enough so that the white Democrats would control the district, and that has changed, right? And so there is more representativeness there. And the last thing I will say is, like, under California's new maps, you know, as a party wins more votes, it wins more seats, right? That's kind of what we think the democracy should look like, right? You know, Republicans and Democrats have an equal opportunity to win more seats. This year happens to be a very good Democratic year in California. Democrats will probably pick up seats, but if you measure it, Republicans have that equal opportunity if they just sort of figure out what they need to do in order to start to win more votes.
So this is in, I think, part reference to a comment I made, and I want to emphasize that the jury is still out on some of this. So some of the research on this issue of the effect of district boundaries has not addressed partisanship. That's the open question. There is research, however, on the way that district boundaries have been drawn in formerly at-large systems. So there are some municipalities that elect city councilors by at-large districts, and there's a sense that those discriminate against minority candidates. So they redrew districts with the intent of trying to mitigate those effects, and frequently we found that it doesn't actually increase minority representation because minority candidates haven't run. But the point is that, I think the point that Mr. Wright has made a few times now is that the focus here is on the process. And the process has the potential of invigorating democracy and making this process more transparent, so at least that we understand that the districts were drawn in a neutral way, and that allows voters to participate in this process in a way that that gives them confidence that the outcome wasn't established before the election was ever held.
I'll take a little stab at this too. So I don't disagree that this, if this were to pass, we would get some of these effects with invigorated parties. But I think the effect would be small relative to other things. And so I give an example. I live in Oklahoma now. So this last year, our teachers went on strike. They wanted a pay raise. And as a result of that, we have there might be Democrats and Republicans running in almost every single race in the state. And so we've seen the parties reinvigorated by other things. And so, you know, again, we might see an effect from this initiative, but there's so many other moving parts to politics that tonight we're focusing on redistricting, you know, things about competition, you know, there's so many other things that are going on that are going to drive those things. Having quality candidates running is going to increase competition. Having, you know, voters are invigorating and really caring about things, you know, that's also going to have all these changes. And it doesn't all stem from redistricting. I'm not to say that it doesn't contribute, but something sometimes social scientists do is try to say, that's the thing. But, you know, there's so many moving parts to this that it's hard to pick out, you know, well, what exactly made the change.
Maybe anyone else who'd like to pose a question?
Back there.
Okay, so my question is actually, we're talking a lot about like Democrats versus Republicans, and one of you cited actually how many in each party actually is registered to vote here, and so I wonder whether a conversation about incumbents is more important for this redistricting proposition. So I guess my question is, with states that have created these commissions and or drawn lines, have you seen a increase in new politicians being able to win the ballot rather than the incumbent taking the ballot?
Yes, and in California, that's certainly the case. You know, as I mentioned, California had an incumbent protection, bipartisan gerrymander. In 459 elections in the first decade of this century, only one incumbent lost during that entire period. After the new maps were drawn, you had a number of retirements, you had a number of incumbents lose. There probably will be more changeover as incumbents decide to leave. And you've seen a change in what kind of people win office, right? It's very hard if you have a district that stretches 200 miles to actually sort of campaign when you have much more compact districts. It's easy to say, hey, I'm the city council person for Provo or the mayor of Provo, and then you know me, and you know that the Provo is a big part of your district, and suddenly it becomes like, oh, I like that person. when they were a mayor or city council person, I'm going to vote for that person for the legislature. And so that does change it. You know, it would be completely different if you had a slice of Provo and the district ran way south or east or west. You know, that would totally change that. And so, yeah, I mean, that has been among the benefits. And you're absolutely right also to point out that incumbent protection is a big part of the process, and a big reason why many people want to sort of keep control is because they like being in the legislature, they like being in Congress, and they want to maintain control of the process.
Just to build on that, so some of my research, I looked at who runs for office and who does well. And so people that do well are people that came from maybe another political jurisdiction, probably step below, like a state legislative seat or state senate seat, and then they run for the congressional seat. So the more overlap you have between those two areas, the more likely someone's going to emerge to run, and the more likely they're going to do well and win. And so I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the criteria I wrote down and listed a little bit is to try to match up as well as you can the different political areas up until the bigger districts. And so if that is going to happen, you're going to have sort of, I guess, what happened in California is there are going to be strong candidates who will emerge because their districts overlap. And if you think about it, you just need those same voters to vote for you before to vote for you again, and maybe a few more depending on the district, that side of the district below.
So we'll, of course, invite you to stick around after we conclude to talk more with the panelists. But now I want to move to closing remarks from each of them, and we'll begin with Dr. Creston.
It's hard to close on something like this. Again, I don't have this is a good plan or a bad plan. I do agree that there's a good, I will say this, there's a good process where lots of people are involved. So, the first part of the process was getting voters to sign their name, to put the plan on the ballot. Then they're going to have to vote to approve it. And so, any process where there's that many people involved, I think you're at least going to achieve some of these goals of getting people to pay attention to politics, get involved with politics. And it's hard to say, like, well, sort of this plan was imposed on us. If you have to get that many people to sign their names and then vote for it. The outcomes, it's a little up in the air. Us political scientists, after the last presidential election, we try to throw away our prediction hats. A lot of us did very poorly. So, I don't know what you're going to get, but you're certainly going to have a process where lots of people have the opportunity to have a say in the matter.
Dr. Maccabee.
So as part of my research, I use a computer to redraw district maps and hypothetical maps using neutral redistricting principles. So we just want to draw as many maps as we can randomly that have districts that have an equal number of people and that are completely contiguous. We can hardwire in some of these other ideas of communities of interest or county boundaries or whatever else. When we ran these simulations for Utah, for the congressional districts, out of 10,000 simulations, one of them was as extreme to the degree that Democrats were excluded from the process. Just one out of 10,000 exhibited the patterns of partisan bias that Utah's map currently exhibits. So 1 out of 10,000. So the contention that the commission would have to gerrymander the map within an inch of its life in order to achieve a well-established standard of partisan symmetry is absurd. No. They've already done that. The legislature has accomplished that. 1 out of 10,000. Think about that. 1 out of 10,000. They had one chance to knock it out of the park and they did it. So the way around this is, and I think that for a host of reasons, the way that this initiative goes about doing this is a step in the right direction for Utah. So to make this as transparent as possible, to make this, to give commissioners, nonpartisan commissioners, standards that they should meet, and engage citizens in this process. And the likelihood that they repeat the sins of the past are roughly 1 in 10,000 if they're just following those standards, roughly. 1 in 10,000. Utah can do better. Most states in the country can do a lot better. And I commend folks in Utah for thinking about this and the folks that have tried to advance this ballot initiative.
Mr. Lee.
So I began on sort of a dark note talking about how we were at a gerrymandering crisis. But I want to end it on a positive note, which is we're also at really an inflection point in our democracy. This year, as I mentioned, you have 4 ballot initiatives on the ballot to fix redistricting. They're all very different from one another. They're all very unique to their states. In addition, you had Ohio earlier this year, so that would make 5 states this year. We've never had that kind of energy. When I go to places like Michigan and Ohio and talk to people, I talk to Republicans and Democrats. They tell me that they canvassed a neighborhood that is very mixed partisan. It had Democrats and Republicans mixed in among one another, and they knocked on the door and they talked about taking power out of the hands of politicians and giving it to the people, and everybody signed. And that's very different than even just 10 years ago. If 10 years ago when they tried to do this in Ohio, they did polling and nobody understood what gerrymandering was, nobody understood what redistricting was. It didn't move voters one way or the other. It just wasn't an issue that resonated with people. Increasingly today, people get it. They understand that something is broken. They think the political class is not necessarily, and this is Democrats and Republicans, the political class is not necessarily looking out for them. And they think that there is a better way, and they're able to do this in part because states like California have broken through and proven that you can do these sorts of reforms and not have worse results, and in fact, in many ways, have better results. And so, people feel something is broken, and people will have a real chance in these states, including Utah, to do something that will help move us in the right direction. And if Utah passes this, as I said earlier, it will be a model in many ways for people in other states, people in Georgia and Louisiana and other states that are beginning to talk about reform.
Mr. Wright.
This is an easy close for me because I get to say vote for Prop 4. And I think if you support transparency, if you support accountability, if you support a check on power, if you support a check on conflict of interest, if you support an independent commission of your fellow Utahns deciding the fate of our maps and our boundaries, Proposition 4, I think, will go a long ways in achieving those objectives. We believe this is about a process, not about an outcome, and we believe a better process will create better boundaries. So please vote for Prop 4.
Excellent. That concludes tonight's discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists from the Brennan Center for Democracy Program, MAGLEBY, from Binghamton University, Dr. Maccabee, University of Oklahoma, Dr. Michael Creston, and last but not least, from Better Boundaries Campaign, Jeffrey Wright. Thank you all for being here, and be safe.